Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for the second session in our sub-series, Marx and Democracy. Tonight, Kevin Bean is the main speaker. He'll pick up from last week's session and take a particular close look to the 1848 revolutions that swept through Europe, bourgeois revolutions, and the attitude of Marx and Engels to them. And perhaps that could teach us something about our attitude to similar events, if there are similar events these days. Okay, Kevin, I believe you have a PowerPoint that I'm supposed to share, or did you want to say something first before I'll share it?
No, put the PowerPoint up, please, Tina.
Okay, dog. Oops, wrong one, of course. Okay, let's do this. Yep, there it is. You can start.
Okay, comrades, good evening. As Tina says, this does follow on from last week. If comrades press the full screen so that the PowerPoint covers the whole of their screen, they'll, as you might say in the cinema, get a better cinematic experience, but we'll see. Okay, I want to begin with a quote from Marx and Engels that comes from the early 1840s, from the book that, in a sense, settles accounts with some aspects of German philosophy. I think you've, and it says, history does nothing. It possesses no immense wealth. It wages no battles. It is man, real living man, who does all that, who possesses and fights. History is not, as it were, a person apart, using man as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims. And this quote is widely known, it's widely used. And why I think it's important is to remind us that what we're looking at here is not just theory, not just indeed philosophy, but Marx and Engels as political activists, people actually intervening in a political movement and indeed drawing lessons from it. Indeed, probably it was the most formative experience for both Marx and Engels, and in turn is going to shape their politics and the politics of the working class movement in the rest of the 19th and indeed into the 20th century. So for those people who consider Marx just to be, quote, an intellectual or a theorist, this is a period when he's really in the thick of a revolutionary struggle. And for those people who just consider him an activist, this is also a period when he's developing ideas and above all developing theory. So it's very much a learning exercise, and it's very much something that phrase, their history does nothing, it is real, it is man, real living man. And that's what I want us to approach this section. I'd like to just to refresh people's memories about the 1848 revolution. So the map would be useful there, Tina. It's the second slide, I think, on that. And this map reminds us that in 1840-1889, large parts of Europe were affected by revolutionary movements, and those movements took different forms. They all were democratic in one sense or another, but some, for example, emphasized the national self-determination in the various empires, such as Austria, indeed in Germany as well, Italy, and so on. So there were national movements. There were peasant movements demanding the end of feudalism. There were democratic movements demanding the abolition of absolute monarchies and feudalism, and a form of democracy, republic in particular. And there were also working class movements that put forward specific working class demands. So when we're talking about 1848, the revolutions in Europe, we're talking about a range of different experiences across the continent. What I'm going to talk about this evening is primarily focusing on Marx and Engels in the particular corner of Germany, that one of the most advanced industrial areas in Germany, and it's going to be their experience there. In the years that followed, particularly in the 1850s, they wrote about the experience of the revolutions in other places, particularly in France, and I will touch on those, but it's largely going to be their role in Germany that I'm going to look at. A couple of little pictures, partly to just give us a sense of this revolution, but also to remind ourselves that we're on the edge of the contemporary world. These are some of the first political photographs. This is a photograph of barricades in France in June 1848. And you can see the barricades down the street there. So we have a few other pictures of that period. And then the other one that's from Britain, don't forget that the Chartist movement, which is a great inspiration for Marx and Engels, is also active in the spring of 1848. This is the great demonstration on Kennington Common. Again, one of the first sort of political photographs, and that was only discovered relatively recently. But of course, much of the images of the revolution are taken from other forms of art, prints, derograph, and so on. And this is probably a classic sort of image of those revolutions, of heroic figures on barricades. In this case, it's students at the University of Vienna, the flags, the barricades, the heroic poses, which is often the way that this revolution is portrayed. But of course, as the next slide shows, it is also brutally suppressed, initially in France in June 1848, but then in a series of counter-revolutionary moves beginning in the autumn in various parts of Europe. For Marx and Engels in the Rhineland, in Cologne, this period begins in September 1848 and then continues to reach a culmination in the spring of 1849. Now, last week we talked, as Steve and Luke and I to a certain extent talked about the place of the 1848 revolutions in Marxist thought. And in the next slide, I summarize that, or rather I summarize some of the themes that I think are important in thinking about where 1848 stands in the development of the thought of Marx and Engels. Steve, quite correctly pointed to the influence of the French Revolution, and I think it's something that comes up in Marx's writing, both about 1848, but later as well in the evaluations of 1848. We also, I think, need to be aware of how Marx moved from being a radical Democrat to becoming a fairly conscious and developed communist, although again, the nature of his communism will change. And much of these developments occur initially theoretically and philosophically through his settling of accounts with the Hegelian movement, the young Hegelians, the radical German philosophers, and particularly arriving at a conception of historical materialism, about the historical development of society, and particularly the nature of capitalism, and the way that capitalism has produced both, or it produces a bourgeoisie of a particular type and also a working class. Now, this is, I think, an important theme about the relationship between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie. In Germany, which, although developing industrially, particularly in the Rhineland, still has large rural populations, particularly has feudal reactionary landlords and absolute monarchies. So the class relations are very different from those that we would have known in the Britain of that time. And it does pose the question about the nature of the revolution that is going to occur, and in particular, the attitude that communists should adopt to it. Should, for example, communists participate within what is clearly going to be a bourgeois revolution that will overthrow feudalism and absolutism? And if they do participate in it, should they have specific demands, or should they simply appear as radical democrats? What should, for example, the role of the proletariat be? Should workers have their own separate organization? Should they advance distinct demands? Or should they, again, fall largely behind this democratic movement? Why I think these are important strategic questions for Marx is because they do, in a sense, relate back to his theory. And again, this is the point that I want to keep on making about the way that practice and theory interact with each other in Marx's thought in this period, and as indeed for the rest of the rest of his political writings and career. When Marx becomes a communist, he does this through engagement with various other communistic trends. And many of those trends are utopian in the sense that they have an ideal of a communist society, and they pose this ideal as either a blueprint which can be achieved through conspiracy. I remember again that the French Revolution had thrown up conspiratorial traditions. They'd thrown up the conspiracy of equals, Babeuf, Buonarroti, and others. And this tradition of conspiracy, of maybe an armed putsch, of overthrowing the existing political order, and then either imposing some form of communism. Marx talks about barrack communism or barrack room communism, almost the type of sort of military dictatorship, almost reminiscent of aspects of Sparta in the classical world, or whether some other force, or indeed whether employers and the ruling classes could be persuaded that capitalism or feudalism was in some senses wrong, and they could simply be persuaded that this was a better system. Again, comrades will be aware that Robert Owen, in his writings, dedicated some of them to the monarchs and the prime ministers of the time, and hoped that they would see sense in this new reorganization of society. The other way that Marx is developing his ideas is an understanding of the nature of the proletariat. Who are the proletariat? Many of the existing communists that Marx comes into contact with in Paris and also in amongst the German exile community come from an artisan section of society. These are sometimes small property owners, they're skilled workers, and they, in a sense, are a type of urban petty bourgeoisie. Much of their politics, although communistic, looks back to a type of golden age. And indeed, it's often based upon sort of returning almost to a Garden of Eden of brotherly love. Although in their politics, they don't often practice those sorts of virtues. They can be quite vicious with each other. So Marx is involved in these discussions, and his historical materialism and his way of understanding the development of society, particularly the application of the idea of immanence, that one form of society is immanent in another. That, for example, capitalism is creating a proletariat, it's creating the means of production which will provide the preconditions and indeed are, in a sense, producing the form of the new society. He talks about the womb of the new society being, the new society being present in the womb of the old. And so again, this sort of pattern of social change and above all the need for a mass movement of workers, the idea of self-emancipation and self-education, and above all what he calls a real movement becomes really quite vital. So this is not just a theorization. This is the idea that you have to persuade, you have to build organizations through formal education, but also through political education, newspapers, magazines, speeches, the building up of an organization. His early organizations, such as the Communist League, do in many ways mirror those of a contemporary political party, with subscriptions, with a newspaper, and with all of the structure of branches or circles, to go along with that. So these are some of the sort of ideas which are clearly in the air. And what's interesting on the eve of the 1848 revolutions, particularly in the Communist Manifesto, which I'll look at in a moment, is that many of these ideas are already, in a sense, there. People are expecting revolutionary movements. They're particularly looking at France. Its revolutionary tradition provides, in a sense, a framework for people to act. But also the 1840s, the so-called hungry 1840s, are a period of economic dislocation, unemployment, banking crisis, famines, not only in Ireland, but in parts of Eastern Germany as well, financial crisis, also spreading from Britain into continental Europe and the Americas. So what we have on the eve of the revolution is already, in many ways, quite a developed political program by Marx. And that program particularly focuses on the importance of political demands and, in particular, the struggle for democracy. And I'll look at that, particularly in two documents which I've reproduced here, and then go on to discuss how we might interpret the debate. But I'll just bring Steve in for a moment, just really to sort of sum up a little bit from last week.
So thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think in some ways you've covered it. I just wanted to remind comrades of the basic thesis that you can see in what you've just put up there on the previous PowerPoint. And that is a development of a Republican kind of communism as opposed to an anarcho-communism. The Republican communism was political, was putting its emphasis on political struggle and political demands. Now, as I was arguing last week, between about 1842 and 1844, Marx was a Republican and not a communist. And you can see that in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right and in the Jewish question. But in the Jewish question, he's making the transition to communism. And as we arrive there, Kevin, where you are, when we get to the Communist Manifesto, it appears at first sight to be an argument without any republicanism in it at all. The R word doesn't appear anywhere in the Communist Manifesto. It comes up in disguise, and that's where I think you're about to highlight that disguise when we go on to there. So in a sense, when Marx goes over to communism, because of the reality and the imminence of this revolution, he's forced to confront the question of, well, the bourgeois republic anyway. So in other words, he doesn't give up republicanism when he goes over to communism. It comes back in. It's forced for him to consider it. And of course, he's in a battle with these true socialists, the Proudhonists, the utopians, who are not interested in political struggle and therefore have got no interest in republicanism at all, which they just see, oh, well, that's part of the bourgeoisie. And Marx is and Engels is very strongly opposed to that. Now, having said that, Kevin, I think it now spins neatly into the Communist Manifesto and neatly into, is there any republicanism in the Communist Manifesto question?
Okay, Steve. Well, I'm going to, after the section there, selections from the manifesto, I just want to look at a couple of them. And I've taken these phrases not at random, but they do talk about the way that Marx focuses on the battle of democracy. And in particular, the idea of the proletariat as the right to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class. So Steve is right, the phrase republic isn't used, But I think what we're looking at here is the equation of democracy and republicanism. And in particular, the idea of using political supremacy to wrest, as it says, by decrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie and to centralize all instruments of production in the hands.
Bitte, Emma.
To centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So the equation there is of democracy and the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and that this new state will have that proletarian. Marx later goes on to use the phrase dictatorship, but it's essentially the idea of the proletariat as the ruling class in that way. Now, why I wanted to highlight this is, of course, that when it comes to the 1848 revolutions, we will see how far this becomes a central question and the role of the working class in that. The next quote is, again, I suppose, a more general one, but I think it's, and it should say momentary, sorry,
yes, I was going to say
spell
that,
check there, please. It's not the monetary interest, but the momentary interest. That really would be economism. But the point, I suppose, is that we're looking at both the idea of immediate aims, that in the manifesto it talks about immediate aims. It puts forward a famous 10 points, and those 10 points you know, are in the 19th century of a radical nature. But I will recall that in the 1970s, a British newspaper said we're only one demand away from a communist society, because Marx's demands have been met, particularly in progressive income tax, which was a big bone of contention. But it's this idea as well of representing and taking care of the future, I think, that's important. The relationship between immediate demands and, above all, the communist future that we wish to see. And so we're not getting just a series of demands on taxation or whatever. We're getting demands about organizing the proletariat as the ruling class. Now, this issue, I think, is then the nature of this revolution and how it will proceed is then dealt with in the next slide, and particularly the relationship between the bourgeois revolution and the proletariat. And I want to just read this line out and perhaps get comrades to think about it in the discussion. And this is the communists. It says, in Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way. That is, they fight alongside the bourgeoisie against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. Come back to that in a moment. But they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And then it says why they turn their attention to Germany, because the country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution. Now, there are a couple of interesting points in here, which again are worth discussing, particularly the hostility to the petty bourgeoisie. When Engels, the only amendment that Engels ever made to the Communist Manifesto from the translation was to change petty bourgeoisie there to Philistines. And it's still unclear whether this was some sort of mistranslation or indeed whether in the original framing that that Marx and Engels saw the petty bourgeoisie as a reactionary class. This will become important later in German socialism in terms of the whole idea that the other classes other than the proletariat form a reactionary bloc. So that perhaps needs to be considered, in particular the attitude that communists would take towards the peasantry, or indeed those artisans that we've been talking about, that capitalism will be squeezing and either proletarianizing or indeed in other ways undermining their position. But also the argument about the clear recognition of hostility between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that after the fall of absolutism, then the argument goes that the fight against the bourgeoisie may immediately begin. So on the eve of the revolution, it's very clear from this that the push will be to push for opposition to absolutism towards feudalism, with some ambiguity about the approach towards the petty bourgeoisie. Now,
can I just say something there, Kevin? Just a comment, if you don't, I don't want to get you out of your stride, as it were, but I guess that's a formulation of permanent revolution. In other words, this first bourgeois revolution goes over immediately to a proletarian revolution. It's like one revolution turns into another.
Well, the use of the idea of the revolution in permanence, which I will deal with towards the end, is, again, it depends. It's the idea of I think revolution in permanence rather than permanent revolution. We'll perhaps come back.
So I don't want to get stuck on particular terminology of particular groups, but the idea of the revolution flowing over from one to the other, going in transition, or going over immediately, as it were.
That certainly comes up in the address of the Communist League, the address to the Communist League in 1850. Yeah. Now, I've said that the Communist Manifesto appears in February 1848. It appears almost at the same time as the first revolutionary outbreak in Paris. But in practical terms, in terms of the German Revolution, the most important document, one which was widely circulated, and indeed even contemporary reports suggest that it had a good penetration, is in fact the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, if I can. So it's interesting that it doesn't say of Germany, but in Germany. In other words, the idea of the Communist Party as an international movement, and that this is, in a sense, the German section of it. It's fortunate that we have a German speaker with us this evening, and I'm sure that she can read very badly printed Gothic script.
Is it the next slide?
Yeah, it's the next slide.
Forderung der Kommunistischen Partei in Deutschland. Yes, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, das stimmt. So, what I think is interesting about this is that when we look at this document, which is, clearly shaped by the Communist Manifesto, it's clearly linked to the type of demands and position that's going to be put forward in Germany itself. And this is where Steve's search for the Republic finds a bit of gold. Because if you look at the next slide, you'll see there that it begins with what are essentially the first four demands there, other than proletarians of all countries unite. It begins with a whole series of Republican democratic demands. It puts the struggle for a united, indivisible republic really center stage. So this, again, I think shows the key demands that are being put forward by Marx, certainly in this stage of the revolution. Now, the other points which I think are useful, and they certainly come from both the experience of the French Revolution, and indeed they will prove practically to be very significant, is the idea of the indivisible republic. That formulation is the united indivisible republic is taken straight from the French Revolution, but also the universal arming of the people, and the idea that it's posed there almost in terms of value for money, but it's also the idea that the armies will defend the rights of workers. They will be the best way of guaranteeing the success and indeed the permanence of the revolutionary government. So quite a central feature, and indeed this will come up in terms of the Paris Commune and in much of Marx's analysis of particular events, that at key stages in the revolution, the workers and indeed the wider people, come to that phrase in a moment too, will have not been armed and they've not been mobilized in that sense, that that they've, in a sense, been kept off of the stage. The other one in the next slide, which again, plenty of detail in it, but the point I just want to address is in bold. And the measures there all deal with essentially peasant questions. They all deal with the demands of peasants. Again, they're very much based on the tradition of the French Revolution, very much based on the idea that in the key stages of the revolution, the peasants could, in a sense, either swing behind the landlords, be mobilized in a reactionary way. Marx again had in mind there the Vendée experience in the French Revolution. But if the revolutionaries made an appeal and indeed did what the French revolutionaries did within a matter of months, in August 1789, and in effect get rid of feudal restrictions, distribute land, get rid of feudal dues, and so on. So what we have here is a program that is both for the Republic, but is also clearly aimed at the rural population. And this, I suppose, brings us back to the sort of dynamics of this revolution. And if you just look at the last slide, again, I'm afraid it looks a little bigger on my screen, but it's actually the last section in bold. And I'll read it out. It is in the interest of the German proletariat, the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry, notice the petty bourgeoisie have now been brought in, to work with all their might to implement the above measures, because it is only the realization of these that the millions of until now been exploited by a small number in Germany, and whose exploiters will attempt to keep them in subjection, will attain their rights and that power owed to them as creators of all wealth. So how are these demands put into practice by Marx and Engels? Well, time doesn't allow me to go into a sort of blow-by-blow account, but Marx and Engels do return to Germany in March 1848, when revolutionary movements throughout Germany have either overthrown monarchs or curtailed their power, and there are revolutionary situations. They go to Cologne, which is a major city in the Rhineland. They don't go to Berlin, the Prussian state capital. They go to Cologne because it is one of the more economically developed areas. They begin their political work in three areas. One area is in the workers' society, in a sort of educational society, and this will be a key area for them. The second area of work is in a democratic society, and this will be a broader grouping, which will include some bourgeois, some petty bourgeois, and indeed some workers. And they also begin to make attempts to build a movement amongst the peasantry. They, for example, issue leaflets. Those demands, for example, are printed and distributed. And indeed, they encourage people to go into the countryside and to agitate in that way. Now, what very quickly emerges are a number of sort of tactical splits. And what I think is interesting about them is that when you first read about them, you are not entirely clear, certainly in much of the sort of standard coverage, quite what is going on. And one of the splits occurs in the Communist League itself, between a number of activists, particularly Andreas Gottschalk, who's active in Cologne, but also Stefan Born, who's in Berlin. And they argue that the workers' demands, particularly workers' economic demands, should come to the fore. And indeed, they sort of make accusations that Marx, in particular, is spending too much time focusing on bourgeois democratic demands. Indeed, that the workers' demands have been rather sidelined. And what I think is interesting in the discussion is Marx argues that given the state, both the organization of the proletariat, the size of the proletariat, but above all, the immediate tasks in terms of political democracy, that simply to raise economic demands would, in a sense, compress the workers' struggle. Now, what's interesting in the discussion of this is that much of the coverage of this division, which is going to rumble on in various ways throughout 1848, often portrays Marx as wanting, in a sense, to impose a particular model of revolution, particularly some left critics of Marx, or indeed even some bourgeois historians say that Marx is essentially a dictator, is anti-democratic, and that all he really wants to do is to sort of concentrate on his own rather narrow line. But I think if you read both his own writing on this and indeed some of the manifestos and some of the other material, what he's trying to, in a sense, concentrate on and centralize on are political as opposed to economic demands. And Gottschalk in particular, although he can appear to be representative of the workers, in many ways he's dismissive of politics. And indeed, in saying that the demand for the Republic is of only of interest to the bourgeoisie, he then, in a sense, comes up with an even worse position, which is very reminiscent of a position that will later be adopted by Lassalle, and indeed I think is often quite linked to those who sort of stress practical workerist type of demands. Gottschalk says, we don't trust the bourgeoisie because they're employers, but we would trust the monarch who rises above all of these interests and talks in favor of a constitutional monarchy. Again, very reminiscent of Lassalle's negotiations with Bismarck. And also, I would suggest some of the sort of Bonapartism of the, the savior from on high. So the class feeling that Gottschalk sort of embodies is valid. I mean, after all, it's there in the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie are not to be trusted. We will, imbue the workers, instill the workers with hostility towards the bourgeoisie. But it's the narrowness of those demands which look, left. It looks left to be arguing in this way. But what it doesn't do is to raise the idea of the working class as the ruling class, which the democracy argument will do so. So Marx does use the formulation of the people. He does, in a sense, say that at the state of the revolution in Germany, this will involve not only the proletariat, who will be, probably the most consistently revolutionary grouping, but it will also involve the petty bourgeoisie. It will have to involve the peasantry, who in the Germany of the 1840s are still the majority of the population, particularly over into the east, into Prussia and Brandenburg and Silesia and so on. And it will also involve sections of the bourgeoisie as well, who have a common interest at this stage in overthrowing absolutism. Now, this alliance always has tensions, and indeed what happens very quickly, indeed almost from the beginning, is that it frays, and Marx is very clear about that fraying. So, for example, his newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, initially has subscribers who are bourgeois, but as soon as it begins to put forward its radical demands, the subscribers start to leave. And indeed, that fragmentation becomes all the more apparent, particularly when in forms of concessions, the Prussian government gives a form of a constitution. They appoint liberals. As ministers. And indeed, there are signs that those sorts of concessions will allow the the bourgeoisie to sort of regard the the revolution as over. So Marx, before the revolution, had few illusions in the bourgeoisie, and I think this is quite important because, again, many accounts seem to suggest that Marx believed that the bourgeoisie could be reliable allies. I don't think that's true. We can see that from the Communist Manifesto, but the experience of what happens in Cologne, disproves that. But again, he persists with work in the Democratic Association because there are sections of workers involved in it. There are sections of the petty bourgeoisie as well. And because above all, he wants, I think, to encourage that idea right there in the manifesto of the proletariat as the ruling class. And above all, the idea of education and of developing that role. So the experience of 1848 of the bourgeoisie peeling away, and indeed in France in the June days, and in Vienna in the autumn, in October 1848, when they clearly go over to the side of the counter-revolution, this confirms this pattern, but it's still one that has, in a sense, to be confirmed in practice. So the idea that Marx only learned this in the revolution, I think, is wrong. And certainly in the period after the revolution, when he's drawing up the address to the Communist League, he makes the idea of independent working class organization. He makes the idea of trust in the bourgeoisie, but above all, he argues that the role, the counter-revolutionary role in the next revolution will be played by the group, in a sense, that's taken the place of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie have now gone fully over to the reaction, the reactionary elements. They've now made their peace with the status quo. And indeed, that failure of the bourgeoisie in 1848 will create the character of the Kaiserreich, and indeed will shape, I think, German history to the bad in many ways well into the 20th century. So he says the lessons there are that there should be an independent workers' party, that the workers in the revolution period should declare their own interests. But this is where the idea of revolution in permanence comes in. And this is where I think the experience of the French Revolution, that the workers will develop their strength. He envisages in 1850 that the next revolutionary wave will be fairly quick. And when he's writing that, he's in a sense writing in expectations of things in a year or two. So he sees the process of the revolutionary development and the development of the proletariat as a conscious revolutionary class as taking place through a revolutionary process over a period of time. The reference there in the Communist Manifesto to wresting control by degrees isn't, I think, gradualism. It's actually a revolutionary period that's not a decisive blow, but maybe over a period of time. Again, on the model of the French Revolution, but also on the model of something that Marx wrote really quite early on about a revolutionary process rather than a sort of coup or a putsch. And again, he's still unclear, and the experience will need to be assimilated, and reflections on the June days in the civil war in France, class struggle in France, and the same with the Paris Commune. He will need to absorb those experiences and develop them. But it's very clear that political demands, democratic demands, but above all, linking that to the idea of the proletariat as the new ruling class are really quite central, and are quite central lessons that he draws. Quite a lot more there for me to go on, but I'm going to end at this point.
I'm just going to add, well done, Kevin.
Steve, did you want to...
I'm just going to make the comment. I'll keep it brief because other comrades want to come in. But just, I think that whole story you've just told, Kevin, illustrates the point I began with last week, that there are Republican communists on one hand and there are anarcho-communists on the other. And Gottschalk, they're economistic in their politics, and that's what Gottschalk represented, and why Marx fell out with him. Whereas Marx, on the other hand, was very political, and he saw the struggle for democracy and a democratic republic as absolutely central to what they were doing. And so I think it illustrates that thesis of the distinction between anarcho-communism and Republican communism is illustrated in the 1848 revolutions. The only reason I use those terms, by the way, is simply because I think it sharpens up what we're talking about. It makes it absolutely crystal clear the distinction between the Republican communists who want to replace the existing state and the anarcho-communists who are not interested in that at all. They want to abolish it and want to concentrate on economic demands, which may appear very revolutionary and can indeed be presented in a revolutionary way, but turn out in fact to be an adaptation to the existing order, which, as you illustrate in Lassalle's case, carries that on. So the strand from Gottschalk and all the other anarcho-communists goes on through Lassalle and shows itself to be not revolutionary at all, but quite conservative.
Even more than that, and thank you both. I mean, throughout your contribution, Kevin, which was excellent, by the way, I totally got, oh, this is like, you know, the demonstrations in Israel at the moment, for example, which we had a session on Tuesday. You know, how should socialists engage with something which, as Moshe Mahova explained, really isn't the working class on the move. It is a part of the ruling class protesting against another part of the ruling class. But, you know, where does that leave us? What should socialists do? What should Marxists do? And clearly they should get involved. Something is happening. There are working class people there, and there are people there who can be won to the working class politically. So you do get involved with your own program, with your own flags, with your own demands, etc., and you build your own following, and you build your own program, and you bring a newspaper. Very important. I think that you mentioned that, you know, Marx and Engels wrote all the time. They produced articles, leaflets, magazines, newspapers all the time, and it's 50 volumes. It just translated into English, more than 50 volumes. But also that interesting that Steve mentioned at the end, and I was going to quickly ask you maybe a question before we open up from the floor. The idea, the argument he had with Gottschalk, which is, yes, like Lassalle, and like much of the left today, it's still there, isn't it? It's still republic, abolish the monarchy in the House of Lords. What's it got to do with us? You know, you hear that on the left all the time, or the PR system. You know, this is just, it's got nothing to do with us. It's for them, you know, it's their house, their monarchy, etc. But as you, I think, underlined quite rightly, this, by taking up demands like that against the monarchy, bringing down the monarchy, that is how we really raise the working class to the potential ruling class, by taking these questions seriously and not just saying, you know, go on strike. The working class will do that by themselves. They know that they have to fight for better wages and for better conditions, and they do it. What they perhaps don't do automatically is think about those big political questions that often people think have nothing to do with them. Why do you think that is still the case, Kevin, that people who call themselves Marxists, you know, and presumably have read some of this stuff, still dismiss the idea of putting big political questions to the fore? Where does that come from?
Well, can I?
No, I'll let Steve in, and then I'll come in after it.
Yeah. I think part of it is, Tina, that people don't think that the democratic republic is the bourgeois republic. In other words, we've already got bourgeois republics everywhere, so we've already got them. Why would we fight for them? Whereas I think what if we understand Marx's idea about the state, is that we don't have a democratic republic anywhere in the world. The closest we ever came to it was the Paris Commune or the Russian Soviet Republic for a short time after October. But by and large, we don't have a truly democratic republic, and therefore it still has to be one. But if you think that America's a democratic republic, well, you know, republicanism's a dead letter. There's nothing to be done. Why bother with it? Just concentrate on something else. And I think it's a theoretical misunderstanding of the democratic republic, given that the bourgeoisie are always keen to claim they're the great democrats. So any republic they're associated with has got to be the most advanced, best democracy in the world, you know. So I think there's a misunderstanding of what we mean by a democratic republic. And if we understand it correctly, then it's absolutely central to Marxism. And therefore, Marx is a Republican communist, as I was arguing before. It's a Republican road to communism. And that's what Kevin illustrated in the Communist Manifesto. It's in there, winning the battle for democracy. It tells you to do that. Yeah.
Kevin, we just had a comment in the chat that Engels made the point that the monarchy was largely irrelevant. That was under Queen Victoria.
Well, if you did, I'm not aware of it, but you know, I'm always willing to be educated. I think that I think the way I would pose it is on the sort of importance of politics, of which the monarchy and state forms, whether we're in a formal republic or not, are absolutely important. And I think it does also go back to an idea about the way that political consciousness changes. I know I'm perhaps using, I don't mean to be jargonistic, but the way that people see the world differently and the way that we raise potential, the way that we get people to consider that they, as workers, as you know, ordinary members of society, can be politically powerful. And if you think of the pressures of capitalist society, educationally, economically, socially, and so on, more perhaps now than would have been the case in the 1840s, the ideological instruments of capitalism are very strong. And republicanism is not, I think, primarily necessarily about state forms and presidents. We, Steve and I and Mike Monet, had an interesting discussion on the idea of republicanism, both as a bourgeois concept, you know, with a long history, but it's the idea, for example, of democracy in all areas of life. So it's not just about even the political structures you talked about there, Tina. It's actually about, for example, recall. It's about democracy in the workplace. It's about a democratic conception of society. So it's, you know, the state and revolution in a sense expresses that. Why I think many on the contemporary left have emphasized the economic route, I think, is to do with ideas of how political consciousness changes, about the revolutionary process. And I think much of that is based upon some examples from the Russian Revolution, some misreadings of the Russian Revolution, and indeed of politics in the 20th century. Certainly, if you look at Lenin's practice, and indeed, you know, in preparation for this, I read some work by an American, August Nimps, on both on Marx's ideas on democracy, but also Lenin's. The whole idea was the raising up the political level, in other words, raising it above the level of economic demands. You know, the debates in what is to be done, you know, which again, that most of us are familiar with them, but I think that the approach of believing that economic struggles lead without very much interruption, maybe in a struggle in permanence, if you want to use that phrase, to political demands, I don't think is necessarily proven. And, you know, we can see this at the moment with the strike wave. You know, there's a very important strike wave on, and yet the political questions of uniting the working class, for example, on the anti-trade union laws, or indeed uniting and developing an alternative political program for the working class from out of those struggles, does not occur, I think, in the way that many comrades want it to. And that's where the political is important. You know, the struggle for political democracy, even in a country like Britain, is still important. On the specifics of the Republic in Britain, you know, the monarchy is important. And you know, Steve and I have debated this question. It's been on record there, so we can comrades can look at it. We're talking essentially about the executive power of the Prime Minister, the monarchical power that's embodied in prime ministerial executive power. That's what we're on about. We're not hung up about whether Prince Charles has got a particular personality or whether there are too many people parading around the place with medals and so on and so forth. We're on about the nature of political power under capitalism. And if you're talking about a republic and you're talking about political democracy, you're raising those questions in a way that even the most militant strike demands don't do.
Can I just mention one thing that I noticed, just very quickly? The idea that a president is really an elected king. The president of France is the elected king of France. The president of America is the elected king of America. Why? Because they've got executive power. They've got the power which in Britain is vested in the crown not being the king, but the state powers that are there. And that's what Marx has criticized. Marx is not in favor of presidential type republic, because he's in favor of a democratic one. And he doesn't think having an elected king, calling your elected king a president, really makes it very democratic at all.
Thank you, comrades. If anybody's got a question or a comment, please click raise hand. I mean, there is a lot of disagreement with what Kevin in particular was saying, but also Steve, that Marx was no Republican, he was no Democrat, he was just a communist. So, if somebody wants to come in and make that point and perhaps argue it a bit, please do come in. We do value debate, makes a more interesting meeting. First one to come in is Malcolm, please. Hi, comrade.
Oh, hello. I want to ask something that's perhaps not quite germane to the argument, in that what I always find extraordinary about all these discussions is the almost total absence of women playing any role in anything. I mean, there was something you put up on one of your screens about who would get the vote, and it would be men over 21. I mean, as sort of in so-called modern times, 1789 French Revolution, the great symbol is the emancipated, bare-breasted woman. Why is it that women are always being sidelined, I guess is the right word? I mean, is that the right word? I mean, if you look at Labour parties never had a woman leader. Labour parties had very few women cabinet ministers. And I don't think Marx was particularly keen on giving women equal rights, or am I wrong in that?
I think you're wrong.
Am I?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to think, but it didn't carry over from, it doesn't carry over, does it? Do you think? Or do you think I'm wrong?
I mean, can I just make a point? And I don't disagree, Ken, with what you said, except that usually in these points of crisis and breakup of states, that's often where women come to the fore in these struggles. That's the thing that happens. These republics, or failed republics even, are opportunities. I think, but I'm not sure, Kevin will correct me, that in 1848, French women got the vote. Now, I might be wrong on that, so I need to correct it. But one example,
1848?
Yeah.
1848? 1944?
Eventually, but they may have lost it. Look, I'm not quoting that one. The one I will quote is a different one that I do know about. So I'm only hazarding a guess there. But in 1649, 800 women demonstrated in green dresses, level of colours, outside Parliament. So there was a mass women's demonstration. People don't really know about this. But during the English Civil War, at the time of the fight with Cromwell over the Commonwealth, women were mobilising and politically active and playing a leading role. And people just don't necessarily, most people don't know that fact. So I'm not sure about 1848 and women. I'll check it out later. Maybe somebody on the call will know. But I had this idea that women did get the vote in 1848, probably lost it again.
As far as I know, the women in France only got the vote in 1944, given by General de Gaulle. But I'm not disputing that women haven't taken leading roles in revolution, etc. But then they always seem to get sidelined and sort of, put back in some secondary place again. I mean, perhaps it's just my imagination looking at all all the photographs taken of politicians together. I mean,
Kevin, do you want to come in on that?
I think that's probably all I've got to say. Go on.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. I mean, I think you're broadly right. I mean, I think there are plenty of instances in revolutionary movements where women play key roles, and Steve's drawn attention to the English Revolution and indeed in the French Revolution itself. And in 1848, women are also involved, not just as symbols, but actually on the barricades and so on.
Of course.
And indeed, I think the interesting thing is that the individual women, and I'm thinking of Marx's daughters who were politicians in their own right, not just famous daughters or daughters of a famous man, would be an example of a type of woman activist who emerges increasingly from the 1880s. And many of those women would not only just be campaigners for women's rights and socialism in the general sense, but they would be working class women. And I think that you might want to link this, in an historical sense, with the growth of women's work in industry. Although in Britain, particularly in England, women's work in industry had a long tradition, large numbers of women workers, even in the 1840s. So I suppose I'm explaining it partly in historical materialist terms. I think there's also the general question of women's role and status in society, and again that varies across time and space. In different countries, women have different roles. I think you're broadly right now. I mean, the demand for equal suffrage does gain ground from the 1880s, and particularly in the social democratic and then later in the communist movements, it does become quite central. The interesting thing for me, I think, is that much of this has been lost, partly because of the visual representations. And I included the barricade fighting there because it does become rather stylized. And we do think of 1848 as, heroic students and chaps on barricades. We don't often see other people who are writing, speaking in meetings, or indeed doing the work of organization. Delacroix's picture from 1830 of liberty leading the nation, is the way that a woman is symbolized as the embodiment of the nation. But that again is not just a particularly gendered way of seeing the nation, but it actually downplays women's activism. So I think we have to look at the status of women in society. I think, from what I know of Marx's biography, I mean, Marx has all the prejudices of his people at the time. I remember reading his comments on whether his daughters would have good marriages and, those sorts of things, the way that people worry about what their children get up to. So, we're not arguing that people are saints, but in terms of the equality of women in the working class movement, I think that in the advanced working class movement, it was fairly common. Indeed, it was a bit of a caricature that it was made up of, noted, advanced women, women who cut their hair short and who smoked and who rode bicycles and did all sorts of things. So, there is that current there, but it is part of the changes in society, I think.
Well, could I just say one last thing, very last thing? I mean, I thought it was very interesting what you said about Marx and his daughters, because we are talking about a complete revolution. I mean, I just used the word very generally, and all of a sudden, his daughters are, I mean, it is not an equal view of the world, is it? From people we would think would be revolutionary. Anyway, I'll let other people.
Well, I'll just wind up on that. I mean, if Marx had been some sort of complete Victorian pater familias, then they would have been locked up at home. And certainly Jenny Marx, you know, is an active participant in revolutionary politics. She's writing, you know, again, they don't have the you know, the social roles of their time. I just bring the point in about Marx to make the point that, you know, all sorts of prejudices are widespread across society, you know, and I remember this letter talking about the sort of, you know, wondering what would happen to his daughters. And it did appear to be a conservative approach. But, you know, he's a man of the 19th century. You know, Engels has I think Engels is rather different. And again, his relationship with the Burns sisters, and indeed, you know, his approach and indeed his work on the origins of the family, again, points to the way that that was being theorized and understood.
I mean, as far as I understand it, that Marx was in favor of universal suffrage, no question, but he always made the point that this would not solve women's oppression, and therefore actually didn't spend very much time on it, whereas the, you know, bourgeois feminists spend a lot of time focusing on suffrage of rich women, as that would be the key that would get women, you know, out of the house, etc., and liberated. Whereas Marx, and especially as Kevin said, Engels, they developed a huge program with Clara Zetkin and others, you know, of truly liberated women. Like even in 1844, the Communist Manifesto includes the phrase "abolish the family," which is massive for that period. You know, they explained there's this enslavement, modern enslavement of women. That's what family is for. It's not, you know, love, etc. It is to keep the woman in the house, etc., as a, you know, a slave to the man and you know, the capitalist. And they developed a much bigger program than just universal suffrage. But we will actually be looking at this question on May the 4th. When Anne McShane will be looking at Marxism, and the women's question. So come back then, and she's an expert on the issue, and she can answer these questions much better.
Okay,
thanks for coming in. It is important because it does read, and that's language at the time, isn't it? German, yes, it's always the male form, just like, you know, writings at that time were throughout the world. Thank you, comrade. Ian wants to come in, and if anybody else wants to come in, ask a question or make a comment, please feel free.
Good evening, comrades, and thanks very much again for another excellent presentation. I want to suggest that 1848 marks not only the decisive moment in the discussion of the contradiction between bourgeois and proletarian democracy, but the antagonism between bourgeois and proletarian democracy. And that's just a footnote here about language. You know, Marx used terms like bourgeois and proletarian, partly because they were fairly precise, but also because there was a classical education. Proletariat was the class of landless laborers in ancient Rome. The Republic in ancient Rome, of course, was anything but democratic as we would understand it. The Senate was the representative of the ruling class. Property owners, one has to own property in order to be part of the Republic. In capitalism, of course, everybody becomes a property owner, even if the only property you own is yourself. You're not a serf, you're not a slave. You need to be able to sell yourself. And of course, even before Marx, this contradiction that exists in the concept of being a citizen was identified by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when he talks about man is free but everywhere enslaved, everywhere in chains. So a recognition that being a citizen in the context of bourgeois society is actually to be part of a system which is based upon exploitation and subjugation. Yes, you own yourself, you are free, but you are also free to starve. And I think the important point here about, and when it comes back to this question of the Republic, of course, as communists, we're not in favor of the monarchy or anything of the sort, or any other kind of deranged anti-democratic features like that. I mean, it's a little bit of a digression, but if we look at the British monarchy, for example, we cast your mind back to the late Queen's uncle, Edward VIII. Nazi sympathizer and a known traitor. I mean, at that point, even the bourgeoisie could have contemplated being a republic because of the danger that he posed. And the affair with Mrs. Simpson was neither here nor there. It was a convenient way of getting rid of someone who was known to be a traitor and a fascist sympathizer. But the problem hasn't gone away. It's within my lifetime that Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister of Australia, was removed by royal prerogative. We know that Lord Louis Mountbatten, uncle of the Queen and well-known nonce, was approached at least to see whether he would head up a sort of government of national unity in the event of a coup against Harold Wilson. It's reported that he declined, but of course we'll never really know the truth. But I want to come back to this question about this contradiction between the antagonism between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy, the point at where, and I think that's the point at where Marx becomes a communist. He recognizes that bourgeois democracy, the republic, and in using that, he would have had in his mind the Republic of ancient Rome, a republic which is about the, and to be a property owner, even if the only property you own is yourself, is to pose a contradiction in what it is to be a human being, the contradiction that ultimately communism will overcome. Every single person has a if you like, a dual nature. We are both citizen and homme, if you like, a citoyen et homme, a citizen, a bearer of rights, and a living organism. And they stand in contradiction to one another. And this is why it's so important that he was writing his critiques of Hegel around this time. These are precisely the antagonisms that are a feature of bourgeois society. That communism will ultimately supersede. So that instead of bearers of rights that only interrelate with one another through contractual forms in the marketplace. I mean, even the most intimate relationships take a contractual form. Think of the marriage. It's a bourgeois property contract, ultimately. And Engels knew that, which is why he married neither of the Byrne sisters. The idea is then that a communist society, relations would be direct and personal, and that similarly, democracy would be direct and personal in the sense that it would be full and participatory. You could have democracy within one's own workplace, within one's home. I was enchanted on Facebook recently to see a comrade who happened to be in hospital. There was a kind of minor uprising on a psychiatric ward because of the lack of custard. And it's thrown up a whole series of interesting discussions. If you cast your mind back to the Russian Revolution, it was known that Soviets would spring up on the Trans-Siberian Express, making decisions about how the train was to be operated, or that kind of direct participative democracy would be an intrinsic feature, certainly in the early phase of communism. The ultimate, of course, is that when you move to a point where we're so used to the idea of democracy that it becomes not the administration of people, but the administration of things. It's people making decisions about, where are we going to put the trees, where are we going to put the children's playground, or whatever else. And rather than it being, because of course, at the heart of bourgeois democracy is antagonism. It's an antagonism between classes, and that's why bourgeois democracy takes the form that it does, of no democracy at all, a democracy of property owners. I think that's all I wanted to say. Oh, just one tiny little thing. You mentioned about revolution in permanence, and language again is important here when we talk about permanent revolution. I don't know what it is in German, I'm afraid, but in Russian, for example, непрерывная революция. So the idea of revolution without a break in the middle, if you like. So there's no break between the transition from, you have a bourgeois revolution that then goes without a pause into the potential for a socialist revolution. And I think it's so important. I think that question arises in 1848. And of course, later on, Trotsky was, of course, attacked for this concept, but it's there in Marx, alive and well. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Ian. We don't actually have anybody else with their hand up. So
there's Joanne up there, is there?
Oh, sorry, she's not got her camera on. Sorry, Joanne, I didn't see you because of that. Could you switch your camera on? There you are. Excellent.
Right. Can you hear me okay? I'm still not convinced by about some of the terminology here, because I think when somebody queried the notion of republicanism and democracy, I think Tina interjected that we're talking about radical democracy, and therefore it occurs to me that the use of language is very important here, and I think our terminology has to be very precise. I think basically what we're talking about is the means of raising levels of political education within within a layer of already class conscious works in the main, but also, you know, others, bringing others into the fold where we can. And I think because human social reality is intensely dialectical, we have to, if we're talking about developing from where we are now into where we want to be, we have to deal with everything from basics. Therefore, you know, some of the points in the that were referred to before, arming of workers, for example, that was one that was mentioned. These things can become other things, you know, through they can become in essence the direct opposite, where we have the insistence on the arming of everybody in America, leading to kids being shot in schools, and also the arming of workers in the mid-19th century. When you compare it with the arming of workers in the 21st century, with the kind of tools that the state has at its disposal, it means that the arming of the workers isn't necessarily a solution that's going to work against a state which is armed with all sorts of weapons that only huge scale production can put in people's hands. The other point was, in discussions online, I come across a lot of what I would describe as soft lefts. In other words, non-Marxist lefts, who will argue about democracy, fetishize democracy, but they're talking about democracy as an abstract, not concrete democracy, which is the sort of thing that we're talking about. Look at the concrete for the democracy which is given to everybody in their daily lives, which is what I would regard as concrete democracy, and also freedom. The notion of freedom is often conceived by the non-Marxist left as an abstract, and this led to the scenes of people shouting for freedom in Eastern Europe, when in actual fact what the whole uprising was leading to was a counter-revolution, not a political revolution to remove, you know, Stalinism, but a counter-revolution to restore capitalism, in which, you know, the freedoms that were gained were the freedoms for the wealthy, and the ordinary human being in those places lost freedom, and yet these were the people that were calling for it in the first place. Same in Hong Kong. The calls for freedom in Hong Kong. You can understand why people want abstract freedom in Hong Kong. But if that abstract freedom becomes the collapse of Chinese communism and capitalism running riot and Hong Kong completely under American hegemony, that's not democracy and freedom. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think I've covered what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Joe. And last call, if anybody wants to come in, raise your hand now or forever hold your breath. Okay. Oh, there is somebody. Ian wants to come back in. Hold on, I'll just make you into panelist. Nice. You can switch on your camera. Unmute. You're back.
Just a footnote on the right to bear arms. It's one of those things that was obviously definitely a feature after the Paris Commune, but before that. But of course, this changes over time. You know, every Swiss man of military age has a rifle at home in the shed or whatever, at home in the garage or in his cupboard or something. But it doesn't of itself lead to a proletarian revolution. People can have arms in other societies, and it's hell, you know, absolute murder everywhere. In the context of a communist society or a communist demands, I would be in favour of the right to bear arms as part of an organised socialist militia. And one saw that, for example, in the Spanish Civil War with the POUM and the CNT having their own militias fighting for the Spanish Republic. That's very different from just simply having the right to have an automatic rifle or a rocket-propelled grenade under the bed or something like that, which is just crazy. Yes, that was what I wanted to come back on. But you know, we're in as a communist, I'm in favour of the right to bear arms, but as part of a revolutionary militia, rather than just simply everybody having a gun just to keep us warm.
Yep, good points, Ian. Kevin, you're moving off lips, but you're muted, I think, if in case you want to speak.
Sorry, I just said to Ian, doesn't he have a rocket-propelled grenade under his bed? I thought everybody did. If
only it would have been used by now, I can assure you.
I mean, it illustrates the point, I think, that in a certain sense why Ian's wrong. In the sense that the right to bear arms is a classic Republican demand. And the idea is that instead of having a small standing army in which all weapons are in the hands of the few and the mass of the population have no access to weapons at all, and are therefore under the dictatorship of the standing army, the democratic demand is that all citizens should have the right to arms, not to go around shooting each other with, like in America or whatever. It's a collective right to form themselves into a militia, to have a people's army where ordinary citizens are trained to have weapons and use it if it's necessary to defend themselves and to defend their rights against other invaders. So in a sense, if we're going to speak about that, we are speaking of a republican state, which at the end of it, as Ian pointed out before, is only a transitional state, Ian, because eventually under human liberation, human emancipation, we won't have states. States will wither away. But the point to get to the state of withering away, the point about this is that you will have to replace the existing state with a democratic republic. And that's really essential to understand Marx's idea. And when you were speaking about monarchy, you were speaking about King X, King Y, Queen Z, whatever. You're thinking of them as individuals, whereas we're talking about the crown as state power. The crown is the form of which capitalist power takes in the UK. Now they have to have a king, by the way, to keep that, to keep us in state of confusion about what we can or can't do. So the monarchy is there precisely for that reason, because it works to keep us away from thinking about those kind of things. But the real power is not the power of the king, it's the power of the prime minister and the ministers of the crown, and the the judges of the crown, and the policemen of the crown who might come knocking at your door looking for that thing you've got under your bed somewhere. So that's the real point. And the point about, just say this thing, the point about the Democratic Republic is not that it somehow arrives. We wake up one day and then suddenly we've got this Democratic Republic. What the Russian Revolution tells us is that to get a Democratic Republic, you have to fight a long class struggle, which is what the Russians did, the Russian working class did during the year of 1917. When they declared a republic, when a republic was declared in February, it wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a massive intensified class struggle to establish a different kind of republic, which is what they were doing. So a republic isn't given to us. It doesn't come out of the sky and just arrive one day. We've got to fight for it. And the beginning of that fight is when the monarchy is sent packing. When the monarchy is sent packing, that's the beginning of a fight for a republic, not the end of it. So I think you're wrong, therefore, to counterpose communism to republicanism. You're right to say, Ian, that a republic doesn't liberate. Isn't Marx understood this in the Jewish question? I think it was there in the Jewish question, that having a republic might give you political liberation. It doesn't give you human liberation, because if you don't deal with the question of property ownership, which is what communists have to confront, who owns the property. If you don't deal with that, you're never going to get to human liberation. So the republic is merely transitional. It's not a substitute for, it's not an alternative to communism, it's transitional to it. And it eventually withers away. The point about, as you arrive at human liberation, we won't need a republic at all. It'll disappear. We won't need a state, if you want to put it that way. We won't need a state at all. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, we've got John, who's got his hand up, but I think he doesn't want to come in as a panelist. John, do you want to just ask a question from the audience? You can speak now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi.
Yeah, the discussion debate is very interesting. A bit over my head, because I haven't read too much on this. I think it was Ian who said that, talking about permanent revolution, Trotsky permanent revolution. Yeah, maybe he could say a bit more about what he meant when he said that that Trotsky attacked Marx's concept of whatever revolution. Yeah, if he could just maybe say a bit about that.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Ian's got another question or comment. You need to unmute again, sorry.
So just on that point, I didn't mean that Trotsky criticized Marx. I think what I was trying to get at was Trotsky had been attacked for his concept of permanent revolution by the Stalinists. The point is that the concept of permanent revolution is already there in the works of Marx.
Absolutely, yeah.
So for Trotsky, he was arguing that the Russian Revolution, a backward country, a country which is, feudalism was only abolished in 1861, could go from being a bourgeois revolution, which was what originally was intended, to becoming a permanent revolution, not as in a permanent revolution in the sense of a revolution that never stops, but a revolution that goes from bourgeois into a socialist revolution without a break. Ni перерывная революция. So unbroken revolution, if you like. And the only other thing I want to just come back on, the only reason I mentioned about Edward VIII is that the bourgeoisie could quite happily do away with the monarchy. After all, it was the bourgeoisie that did away with King Charles I. It was the bourgeoisie that did away with Louis XVI. And the other point about 1848 that I think is always worth remembering is that Frederick Engels was a belligerent. you know, he fought on the barricades. He wasn't just sitting about in the library. He was out there, and that was vital. And actually, some of the works of Engels I've most enjoyed reading is his military histories of one sort or another, history of the rifle, a history of cavalry, and so on. He understood the relationship between the political economy that gives rise to a particular type of warfare, a particular type of fighting, and so he understood, for example, as a result of his experience in 1848, that it's pointless standing behind barricades when your enemy has breech loading rifled artillery. And similarly, it throws the question open then about the demand, for example, if you were in the UK, the demand for a citizens militia, when almost nobody has military experience, when almost nobody has experience with weapons, up against attack helicopters that can fire thousands of rounds a second through buildings if necessary. That poses questions about tactics. So yes, so 1848 military tactical experience as well.
I think we have to make you a new military advisor of the Communist Party or something. Oh, God help us. Okay, thank you. Joanne wants to come in again as well, briefly, and then we're going to sum up. And if you could switch on your camera.
Video muted. I'm muted. Start. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you, but not see you.
All right, start video.
There you go.
Right, I'm here. Yeah, just a quick point. What we saw in Egypt, was it 2010 or 2012 or something like that, was that several million people, I can't remember the exact number, but several million confronted the Egyptian army, and the Egyptian army stood down. But the problem in Egypt was that there was no clear leadership of the revolution that took place, and although the army stood down, we had this brief period of electoral politics, and then the army took control again, because Egypt descended into chaos. But really, the point I'm making is that had there been a political program and leadership in Egypt at the time, perhaps things would have turned out differently. What certainly happened there was that the massively armed Egyptian army didn't turn on millions of people in revolutionary struggle. That's it.
Thanks, Joanne. Okay, comrades, who wants to go first? Steve, I'll give you a few minutes because you've spoken a lot, and then we can get Kevin to
finish off. That makes more sense. Yeah. Just a couple of quick points. Ian's obviously right that the bourgeoisie can do without having a hereditary monarchy, because it's done so everywhere, more or less everywhere in the world. So it's not a problem at all, and they could certainly do without one in this country. But the problem is how you get from having one to not having one. That's the dangerous point. You go from having one to not having one, you never know what's going to happen next. So it's not that we couldn't do without it, it's just that they can't find out how to get rid of it if they had the reason to do so. And at the moment, they've got no reason to do so, because if it keeps a section of the population cheering, then all their property's safe. The point about Marxist critique is that, in effect, a bourgeois republic, they really have an elected monarchy, and the executive power is a power separate from the legislature. It's the bourgeoisie have, in effect, their political power through the executive, through the elected presidency, or whoever else is playing that role in that particular thing, because you can have presidents who are not executive presidents. I suppose the point about revolutions is that the revolution isn't that the standing army gets in one corner and then the people somehow get weapons and stand up against them. That's not how it works. Basically, what happens is the standing army splits. Sections of part of the army decides not to go along with the other part of the army. And when you've got that, you've got a revolutionary situation of some kind. And if you look at those demonstrations in Israel, the fact is that some of the police joined the demonstrations and there were soldiers joining the demonstrations. Now, when that happens, it becomes much more problematic, the stability of that society. You are on the brink of a revolutionary situation. And then when the social situation gets so extreme and people are out en masse, you will expect that some of the soldiers will come over. That's what's happened in Russia. When they come over, they bring their weapons, they hand them out, and other people get them to defend themselves. And that's the thing. The revolution is made by people, not really by weapons. But obviously, if the standing army is united and determined to suppress people, then the people have got very little chance of not being killed, as we see in places like Belarus and other such places. Yeah, I think that's all I really need to say.
Okay, Kevin, you've got 10, 15 minutes if you want.
Okay, thanks. I'd agree with much of what Steve said there, particularly about the sort of practical value of weapons, as it were, and in revolution. James Connolly, the Irish revolutionary, spent a few months in 1916 writing pamphlets, which was published in the Citizens' Army magazine or newspaper on revolutionary warfare. And he looked at barricade fighting and he looked at successful revolutions. And when it came to the implementation of the Rising in Dublin in 1916, for a variety of reasons, it really didn't work. Artillery did the job. And if you've ever seen pictures of Dublin after 1916, a small gunboat plus a few cannons located in Trinity College pulverized the centre of Dublin as if it had been attacked from the air, and it wasn't. Now, the point is primarily political, both in the sense of posing the question of who controls weapons in society, but also of winning over the army in the way that Steve and other comrades have said. So I think it is important to, not see a revolutionary situation in terms of a sort of fight between a big crowd of people with guns. The successful revolutions, if we think of 1918 in Germany, the armies of the Kaiser disintegrated, and the same in the Russian Revolution. And, the comrades have mentioned other occasions when the army has been disaffected, and that's a political point. But there is also a political point in the demand for the arming of the population, coin a phrase from the American Constitution, a well-regulated militia, because we're talking about arguments about who controls weapons and indeed who controls the direction of society. And there is a strong revolutionary tradition of an armed people, not a mob with guns going around shooting each other, but again, the idea of a democratic society in which power lies in the hands of the working class. And I think that that's what that demand is about. Engels did actually look, he was nicknamed the General for obvious reasons, and indeed he kept up his membership of the North Cheshire Hunt to keep his horse riding skills should ever they be needed, when he was riding around the fields of Baden in southwestern Germany. But he also wrote in the 1890s about modern developments in warfare, particularly a pamphlet about, will there be a world war? She writes in the early 1890s about the new, particularly what we would nowadays think of as automatic weapons and machine guns. So he was very, very, very well aware of this problem, this military issue. And again, he poses it as a political issue, but he also makes the point that if you have a conscripted army, which of course you did have in Germany, the question was, what was going to happen to that army? Which way were they going to be pointed? Where would the guns be turned? Would they be turned towards the workers on strike or in demonstrations, or would they be turned on the officers? So the question was that workers were armed. It's just that they were armed in the conscripted army. And what Engels and others in making that demand were trying to do was to say they should be armed in their own interest. And that's a political demand. I mean, I agree. I don't seriously think that automatic weapons are going to do the job against heavy weapons. But I think it's the idea of disaffecting the army, of breaking up the issue of discipline, because there are other demands in terms of election of officers and control of the militia. And it is, I think, a revolutionary demand that goes back not just into the American and the French revolutions. It also goes back to that well-known communist Machiavelli, who advocated a militia, again, in terms of popular mobilization against enemies. And also, he argued not in a particularly democratic way, but he did see it as a possible countervailing force in society. So I think, I am in favor of that, but not simply in isolation and not simply in terms of individuals with guns. We're talking, as we always are when we're talking about democratic demands, we're talking about, collective power. And the question with weapons is, if they're not in our hands, then whose hands are they in? I mean, do we allow the state to regulate them and control them? Are we saying that the state is neutral? Is it safe? Would we rather have policemen with guns? And if we say, well, get rid of the guns, the question is, who's going to get rid of them? Again, these are, key political questions, I think, in that way. On the other question that comes up, which I think would merit at some stage a different, distinct session, is on the idea of the revolution in permanence. The phrase is actually, I think, in origin French, or at least it's not particularly in German. I think the address to the Communist League is written in German and other languages, but I think the idea of permanence is French, as indeed much of our political language and thinking is. It's influenced by the French Revolution. I think the idea of uninterrupted breaks does have, I think, a rather mechanical way of describing a revolutionary process. And one of the questions that arises for Marx, and this is where the sections I had of the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about the working class becoming the ruling class, is in a sense that the revolution is not a sort of a decisive break and, you've got capitalism one day, socialism the next. Certainly, if you read the address to the Communist League, it seems to me, and this is where the phrase revolution in permanence occurs, but what Marx is arguing is for some sort of extended period in which the working class will develop its power, that particularly he talks about making inroads and putting demands on the radical petty bourgeoisie. And the uninterrupted character is, I suppose, that politics is of a particularly heightened revolutionary form. And I think Lenin, if we look at the two tactics of social democracy, Lenin is also arguing in similar ways. So I think that I think this is an interesting question because it links to the idea of the transition from capitalism to communism, which again has come up in a number of our sessions, but it is well worth looking at again because Marx here is still, formulating the lessons from 1848, and he's still trying to come to terms with quite what has happened. And in particular, he's seen events over a period of some months or essentially a year, 18 months or so. And also he's evaluated the lessons of the French Revolution in the same way. So I think that he sees a period of government in which, for example, the working class might take power. And again, if you look at the situation in the Russian Revolution, between 1917 and 1919, and the development of war communism, there is a period of state capitalism. There are all sorts of property forms. There's a working class government, a Soviet government, but there are still clear elements of capitalist society. So I think that this idea of uninterrupted, is, it's when we think of a stabilization period in which some sort of normal bourgeois democracy is introduced. Now, Marx doesn't see it in that way, but he certainly, I think, sees a much longer period. And, the phrase is, when you read the rest of the text, I think you definitely get that feeling from it. But it's well worth, I think, discussing again. On the question that Ian raised at the beginning about the contradictions between bourgeois and proletarian democracy, I think that is, I suppose, the nub of why I began with historical materialism, and why I began, as Steve did last week. We began to look at why Marx, as a radical Democrat of the early 1840s, who's looking at this problem of alienation of individuals from society, and particularly way that he sees the isolation of man and woman, but I'm using the language he would use at the time, and particularly contrasts in that period, in a rather idealized way, the relatively integrated societies of the classical world. He draws on Aristotle's idea of man as a social being, and he talks about species being. He talks about the nature of man can only be fully realized. I mean, this comes across in the Jewish question. He begins in this way of looking at the problem that Hegel throws up of resolving the contradictions in society, which Hegel sees could be achieved through the bureaucracy or through the resolution, those sorts of ways. And he's looking at, again, to use the philosophical language, he's looking at resolving contradictions, and that this again starts off philosophically. It starts by looking at the contradictions in bourgeois society between property ownership and the power that gives you, and even in formal democracies. This is where I think the United States is important. He looks at the formal democracy of the United States and sees there that looks to have resolved the problem. But again, property ownership and class relations, create that alienation. So that is when he moves to thinking of how there's a relationship between the social and economic structure and the political structure. And he then begins to look at the various utopian ideas, and they come up with various blueprints. And that's where I think he does move towards communism, initially of a slightly utopian type, but very quickly through the idea of historical materialism and through the idea of both conscious agency to create a new sort of society, but also that the preconditions and indeed the forms of the new society are implicit, are present in some forms in current society. That's where I think he starts to move towards communism in that way. So I think Ian's right to sort of draw attention to that, because that then informs much of his actual political practice. I put a lot of emphasis on the relationship of both theory and practice here, partly because some of the stuff that I'd read in preparation, and there was a degree of preparation, it might not appear it on occasions, but that Marx is often portrayed as some sort of academic theorist. Now, he did write a lot of books, wrote lots, as Tina said at the beginning, I think the projected collected works would now run to about 150 volumes. You know, he wrote masses of journalism. So, you know, he wrote a lot, but he was also a practical revolutionary who, you know, drew up the rules for organizations, kept the minutes of organizations, who, you know, was concerned about the finance, about the deadlines. Remembering all the things that we're describing, he's going around speaking at meetings, he's editing a newspaper, he's traveling, for example, in 1848, he goes to Berlin, he goes to Vienna, he's, you know, moving around. So he's not somebody in the study. And the reason is that A.J.P. Taylor, the British historian, quite famous in the 60s, said that, you know, said that Marx changed the world by sitting in the British Museum. Well, he did in one sense, but he'd already been out of the British Museum on the streets of Cologne and Vienna, changing the world in that way. And it's very easy, particularly for people who want to downplay the importance of theory and serious political discussion, to just criticize him as an intellectual who writes difficult books. I mean, some of his ideas are difficult and they require discussion, but remember that the Communist Manifesto was designed as a popular introduction, and it still is a great work of literature. You know, it's a good start, but there's a prehistory, which is also important, and more importantly, in 1848, there's a post-history where those ideas are put into practice, and where he's out on platforms arguing, where he's, you know, he's talking to Gottschalk and they're having really quite furious debates. You know, Engels isn't just sitting in the study, he is involved, as indeed is Liebknecht, the other, you know, another great German socialist who will become important. They're involved in the fighting, and, you know, they spend time in prison, and, you know, they face repressions and punishments and so on. Just lastly, to sort of conclude about the development of Marx's ideas, and indeed taking sort of extracts and selections. One of the reasons why I put so much up on particularly the demands of the Communist Party in Germany was, in a sense, to say this is what they were putting out. These were the leaflets they were dishing out. You know, this is what is said in the Communist Manifesto. These are not just my summaries. And, you know, I did attach a bit of a reading list to this, and maybe in other sessions we will look at other aspects of this. But it's important, I think, to look at what Marx said at different stages and how his thought developed. You know, in the Communist Manifesto, he raises questions about the German bourgeoisie. And it's very clear that in his debates and discussions before then, he has grave reservations about how far they will go in the fight against absolutism. And we know then he has those doubts, and they're then confirmed, and he writes about them. So we see a shift in position. Likewise, in his attitude towards the peasantry and in, you know, practical politics, events on the ground and how they unfold have a direct influence on what he's thinking and how he, you know, how it develops. So if for no other reason, looking at what Marx is writing and what he's doing in 1848 is in a sense a practical handbook. You know, Lenin and other revolutionaries used it in that way. They thought about it, they looked at what he's saying, and above all, how it's developing. Because when I put the phrase up on my introduction, I talked about the real movement. What Marx was very concerned to do when he was debating with the utopian socialists was to say, not a movement that you would like to see, not a process that you would like to see, but a process that's actually happening. And in 1848, he's part of a process that's actually happening. And so he has to decide when he's debating with Gottschalk, does he focus on the workers' demands, or does he look at that bigger political mobilization? And, you know, that's a judgment that he makes. And later he discusses, you know, for example, how they organized the Communist League. At one point, they dissolved the Communist League because they think that, in a sense, this bigger movement is now much more important. But he then says afterwards, well, I think we were mistaken, because what we did was we dissipated our forces. We didn't allow ourselves to be concentrated and to really have a, you know, direct role in key areas. So what we're not looking at is someone who is, one, always right, but also is not somebody who doesn't change and develop his ideas. And that's why the study of 1848, I think, is so important. But there's much more to come out of the study of 1848, which there are other countries and the nationalist movement, the relationship of national self-determination to democracy. All of these ideas are in there, and I think are equally as important as some of the things we've talked about this evening.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, Steve. I think some good suggestions coming out tonight. Actually, have another session on revolution in permanence, perhaps coupled with the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If we look at those issues in a bit more detail, would be, I think, very interesting, and all sorts of debates going on the left on those issues, what that means, you know, a special oppression of the other classes that we need to enshrine, etc. So it'd be an interesting discussion to have. So clearly a hugely important period in Marx and Engels' life, and I think you really brought that out. Next week, we're looking at the Paris Commune and what Marx and Engels wrote about it, how they got involved in it, and what they learned from it, and how they changed their views, perhaps, on it when it comes to things like the state. What should we do with the state? So that's going to be another very interesting session next week. I hope you'll all join us next Thursday at 7 p.m. And if you have any ideas for any other aspects that should be discussed, ideally don't just say you should discuss this and this, but perhaps offer yourself off as a speaker or make other suggestions. That would be much appreciated. Thank you, comrades. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.